Okay, so I guess today this is part two, I guess, of our conversation about DC Schindler's book called a Love in the Postmodern Predicament, and we talked about this previously. I'm trying to remember how far we got. Do you remember? Did we get through the into the first chapter? We definitely talked about the intro, but we're kind of I felt like I did a kind of poor job with some of the things in that, so I was hoping we could just rehash some of that and
Sure.
get into some of the depth.
Sounds good.
Do you remember, did we talk about last time Aristotle, the quote that opens the introduction about all men desiring to know?
I think we may have touched on it, but I don't recall if we went into any depth. I meant to go back and rewatch the video to see what we did talk about, but I didn't.
Yeah. So I don't, my memory's so bad too. I don't remember. It was probably like a bunch of series of rabbit trails if I was doing a lot of the talking. Um, but anyway, the introduction, I know it opens with this idea from Aristotle, which is DC Schindler points out like this idea of all men desiring to know, that this has been kind of reaffirmed throughout the course of the centuries since then, that this is something sort of absolutely fundamental to what it means to be human. That somehow we all kind of intuit that there's something very deep about this that's identifiable with like the kind of the very deep nature of who we are, but also that kind of is a sort of distinguishing mark on us as it relates to distinguishing us from the rest of creation, other animals and so forth. That there's something about, and I do think that, in the sense that he's using no here, it's not no in the way we tend to use it, and he clearly distinguishes this right away to make sure that there isn't that sort of confusion about a modern way of knowledge by talking about sense experience and like the sort of pleasure we have at I think he mentions like a bright orange or yellow handkerchief that's made of silk, and like the tactile experience of interacting with that there's something in that whole experience that we take joy in for its own sake. That
Yeah,
it's like it's not a sort of instrumental knowledge that we distill some sort of propositional like handle points that we use to like go out and do something that gains us some sort of advantage. It's just that there's this knowledge of participation with the world that is like we experience it as good in and of itself, without any sort of like need for it to be to some other end.
right.
Um, so I'm curious, like, in interacting with that, like this idea of like this knowledge, and again, not knowledge in just a flat sense, but in some deeper sense, that it is some fundamental aspect of what it means to be human. What do you think about that? What do you feel like that resonates with you, that this is like kind of like some core fundamental thing that we can identify with us as humans?
I believe it must be the case
Yeah.
that that all men desire to know, all humanity. Uh, uh, I think that's definitely the norm. Sometimes maybe it's because we live our lives in, from a Christian perspective, at least in a fallen world, that maybe we don't desire to know as much as we might wish, or that our, in a sense, our desire for knowing is, too easily satisfied uh, by probably something that's some form of false knowledge. Um, but yeah, it is fascinating to me, though, that, well, for one thing, is it kind of comes from a position that, um, even for Aristotle, predating the Christian faith, that it's maybe a manifestation of the logos in some respects, generally of the truth, that we do have a nature, a human nature, And there are times, especially in, it seems, in the postmodern, world, where there's almost a denial of even us having the Greek word, I think, is physis,
Yeah.
to actually have a nature, and in some respects that nature has us, individually. And so it is determinative of our desires and our behaviors, at least in broad terms. So, but again, kind of just picking up on the notion, Schindler often is countering ultimately kind of the nihilism or nihilism that comes out of a lot of postmodern thought. That, to me, again, it's kind of ultimately a denial of that there is, in a sense, an objective nature. And in some respects, it seems like if there's not an objective nature, there's almost certainly no objective truth or beauty, for instance. Yeah. So there's a resonance, I think, that sets up, because, in a sense, determined by our nature, that sets up with this thing that we call beauty. And that's why across the board, at least, again, generally speaking, we can recognize beauty as such. But even on the other hand, even that's in denial.
Why do you think it is? What do you think motivates this denial of us having a nature?
The first thing that comes to my mind is kind of just, and again, as a Christian, I almost without thinking about it, I associate it with our fallenness, that in our rebellion, a desire to be free from any constraints and to be totally free, which, I have to question whether that's really freedom.
Yeah.
Such that no one nor anything defines us. We define ourselves. And to me, that's manifested today in a lot of the, gender issues and stuff like that kind of manifest that. But yeah.
Yeah. And for me, I can't look at any of this and not think of, like, see this all as some sort of manifestation of the outworking of the Protestant Revolution, or Reformation rather. That and I know this is funny for people to think, or for me to, like, even say, but it seems to me like the Protestant Reformation is still so close to us that we don't understand it.
Yeah.
That it's still, like, in terms of the deep ways it's impacted. Like, I don't think any of the movements in terms of intellectual thought and sort of the possibilities that it opened would have been possible without this this radical shifting of the way people think about and take consideration of what is authority in the broadest possible sense. What is a reliable source of authority, and obviously some of that has come down to, and what fills in the blank there is changed, but it is and changes reliably. Like, like the Protestant Reformation tried to put scripture in that spot.
Yep.
And then we've had, like, because another thing that Schindler talks about in this chapter is this idea of the empiricism tradition, and he's using it kind of in a negative sense, specifically talking about British empiricism and the way that's influenced this new definition of what beauty is, that for whatever reason seems to be the one we have inherited, in contradistinction to all the other Enlightenment strands and Romantic thought about that beauty, the British empiricism. And he's using empiricism here in a negative sense, right? But which when I think about empiricism, I think, well, it's just paying attention to what's working and what's not, and having some recognition and importance attached to that need to pay attention.
Right.
But I guess what happens is somehow that this, going back to authority, that this empiricism becomes a sort of pseudo authority. But it's weird now because now it's like, the sort of movements that you just described where there's a denial of nature itself seems completely anti-empirical at its core. Like it's very much a sort of denial even of the quote unquote physical material world's ability to shape us.
Right.
And trying to even cast the authority of that to sort of destroy authority wherever it's found.
Yeah.
Is at the same time leading to these very new, weird orthodoxies of thought that people feel very sort of dangerous to oppose. Like there isn't like a sort of like renaissance of like, I guess there is in some sense, like if you, in certain areas, but even some of what you find online, I feel like it feels kind of even reactionary to that orthodoxy, and in terms of its own, it seems to me to be mostly operating the same spirit of criticizing the authority of this new, whatever authority it is that they and it doesn't, like, there just doesn't seem to be a real flowering of like novel and like new horizons of thought. It all seems so endlessly self-referential, and even I'll find like people online, like I don't watch the mainstream news at all, really at all anymore, because of just it just so, it feels so such a pre-planned affair of like, these talking points, these narratives, every fact has to be kind of extruded through that very narrow window of what they need to say that will score points for, certain political parties that are representative of their audience, like, and so, but even when I find voices that kind of stand outside that, like I was just saying, like they seem to get caught up in a sort of like, well, a lot of their quote unquote reporting is about what the mainstream media is doing. And it's like, it's just it's all like a take on a take on a take on a take, like it doesn't seem like there's anything quote unquote news in it. Like it's just, it's this sort of rehashing of everything. And that's, I think, what's so refreshing here is D.C. Schindler is providing this sort of tantalizing doubt of our doubt to say, well, what if there was something really, what if this manifestation of beauty was an actual manifestation, a phenomenological manifestation of some deeper reality that we can actually participate with?
Yeah.
And he's kind of seeding that as a possibility here in the intro, while he's saying, well, look at what these other things are doing and what sort of effects they're having on us. And is that really, does it really have our best interest at heart, or is it sort of parasitic in some sense?
Right. Yeah. Well, I have a question in regard to all of that. I mean, I think we've kind of been focused on kind of the negative situation that we find ourselves in, and sort of the heritage of that, going back to Locke and Hume and Kant and others, that basically kind of divorced objective reality, if I can put it that way, from any interior relationship. It makes me think about I think it was Locke that had the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate.
But they're kind of in that same humanism strain.
Yep. But anyway, what he, when he's talking under that part, it's called the Doors of Perception in chapter 2. He puts forward a thesis, and he says that beauty, well, he says two things. Beauty offers a paradigm of appearance, so perception. That's the way I wrote it down anyway. I hope I didn't abbreviate. Beauty offers a paradigm of appearance, so perception. In other words, a relationship between appearance and perception. And then he says beauty captures the essence of both appearance and perception.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if, my biggest question to you that came to mind that I'm especially interested in is, what does this have to do with saving the appearances? Does it have anything to do with it? Because I read that, I rarely finish a book, and I read Barfield Saving the Appearances, 2 or 3 years ago. And when I was done, I wasn't too sure of what I'd read. I mean, I had some ideas, and some of it made a lot of sense to me, but still, do you, when you were reading this, did you at all, in a sense, think about appearances, especially in terms of a Barfieldian understanding of appearances?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely related. I feel like they're sort of they're two sides of the same coin. Like I do think Barfield, when he's talking about appearances, is talking about a sort of it's weird because Barfield in many senses is very postmodern, but he's kind of leapt beyond it. He's sort of, I've heard him, I'm trying to remember who I heard him describe this way, like post-secular. Like he's through like this whole modernity, post-modernity stuff. He kind of sees where it's going and kind of has leapt beyond it, which I think part of is what's it's so hard to understand. It's so hard to contextualize what he's saying. But he's using that language in a sort of very precise sort of mechanistic sort of approach, which where he's looking at all the different parts, and so in Saving the Appearances, like he talks about in a sense, when you see a rainbow, like there's this sort of very unique perspective of the perceiver that comes into play in terms of making possible and yeah, I mean, it's so hard for me to talk about Barfield without going into like, because of his approach to things. What's weird is like, I feel like he's trying to do something similar to DC Schindler here in terms of he's trying to destroy our doubt and our doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But he spends so much of his ink on relaying the current mode of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And showing it, of it and like he goes very deep into it, and he spends so much ink on it, and then at the end shows like the final stages to show the sort of the inconsistency and why it doesn't work. But you can if you take quotes out of context, you can almost think he's saying the opposite of what he's saying, often the case, because and he makes that point in many of his books that he says like, he's like, well, I'm clearly standing outside the broader stream of what people think is the way to go on this. So like I have like a double burden of like, I have to show that I clearly understand what they're saying before I can make a claim, so some sort of contrary claim. So he spends a lot of effort demonstrating that this is the claims of what they're making, and trying to put it in an even more ordered form than they're willing to put itself, so that these sort of contradictions can come out, and then that opens the door to his sense of contemplation and a sort of new mode of human consciousness that he's trying to feel like he exposes. But I think D.C. Schindler's doing the same thing, but he's just coming at it from a completely different perspective. So
well, I apologize. I kind of I should have warned you that question was coming, but I couldn't help but think of it because he's using this word appearance and appearance.
Well, it's just so hard. I feel like, with Barfoot, it's really hard to answer anything definitively.
Yeah.
Um,
But it isn't Barfield, and I bring this is an on purpose question because I do know Schindler's great knowledge of Plato.
yeah.
And so that, even though I quote, it's not much to speak of to say you minored in philosophy, but I did minor in it. But still, I came away with the most surface kind of knowledge of Plato. But when I was reading Barfield, it was like, if I understood Plato better, I probably would understand Saving the Appearances better.
Yeah.
It was to me like he was assuming that his educated British audience, especially in the 40s or 50s or whenever, would probably know. And so I don't know. That's the sense I got. This he assumed a fundamental knowledge of of Platonic forms, etc.
Yeah.
The eternal forms.
Yeah. Well, I think
in the forms and that sort of thing. And so I kind of think that's part of what's going on with Schindler, I believe, is because when we get into talking about this interior and the exterior and the relevance between the two, and in a sense, the participation, of course, I know that maybe preeminently refers to the Platonic ideal forms or whatever, but still there's this resonance in a sense of natures. And in a sense, that's what the perception of beauty to me, in a way, must ultimately be grounded in. We don't just have mush for brains, and in which there's no, in a sense, logical, or I have to think of the logos, but that's informing, again, getting back to our physis, our nature, that there's a match. There's again, that the grounding of that resonance and that recognition. If we will but take time, in a sense, to see it.
Yeah. Have you read any of or heard anybody talking about this new David Bentley Hart book about your gods? It's all about the whole supernature versus nature.
Sitting right here.
Okay. Have you? Well,
I'm hoping that it just kind of.
I haven't read it.
Right to my brain.
I've
yeah, it looks of course it's only like 3 or 4 chapters at the most, but even the chapter headings are pretty.
Kale had posted something in the box about like a critical response to it, where it was like somebody coming from a neo-Thomism perspective of trying to say that that this grace, this nature supernature or grace nature divide needs to be kept.
Yeah.
Which I think it's something that's, okay. I think that's they can be useful categories about thinking about things, but I think, again, I don't think it makes sense to talk about them ever being separate. I don't think it ever makes sense to talk about a human as a strictly natural thing, in order to say that there's a natural way of seeing a human that you can look at the natural components and kind of strip that out, and then look at this like grace thing that's added sort of post hoc, or just at certain increments of time by the providence of God. I think is such a I think it's such a what am I trying to say? Like it's such a shrunken view of the world.
Yeah.
And of the nature of God's participation with reality. Like it's, which is funny to me because, like, again, I do think much of these movements of modernity that preceded even the Reformation had their roots in a sort of desire to maintain the sort of dignity of God in some sense, and keep his separation, to keep him unsullied from this yuckiness of below, of earth, and to keep him safe in heaven.
Yeah.
And I think just sort of misses this larger, broader perspective in the past where, Paul talks about God 1 and God 2, where there's a sense in which God isn't just at the top, he's also at the bottom. He is, filling and moving through all things. And so, so for me, that this grace nature thing in this desire to keep them separate, is some, it feels like like what it is. It's a desire. It's ultimately some desire. It's some sort of desire for certainty of trying to, because I think, again, most of what happens in our modern perspective, like anytime you come to some sort of critical juncture, oftentimes you're forced into a position where you do have to oversimplify all the options down to, okay, I'm going to do one of these two things. I'm going to do this or that, because for whatever reason, it seems like we just really struggle with, unless we can get it that basic and simple.
Right.
And but in the process of doing that, we forget that is a sort of a heuristic, a sort of useful lie, but it doesn't encapsulate the depth of reality. And I think part of this makes its way, this sort of dualism makes its way into a sense today where, like, in the Protestant Reformation, one of the things I was just thinking about this is like you have the sense of purgatory gets stripped away. Whereas before there was this sort of like, there's all these layers of nuance of like, and even in Dante's work, right? Like all these layers of hell, layers of purgatory, layers of heaven. Like there's not like this sort of like flat, like, you're either a sheep or a goat kind of thinking. It's binary. Like, it's much more complex than that, and it's much, I think it safely defangs that human tendency to oversimplify by putting some sort of dogmatic barriers to it that the Protestant Reformation just does away with completely. And now you have a whole generation of people that, both through their culturally and their secular materialism, and then kind of religiously through these lines of thought that are grown out of that, but even while still claiming to be religious, are really nested in this sort of like this deep sense of the world as a place absent of God's presence.
Right.
And it's only sort of we get these special sort of Holy Spirit, glasses to look at things every now and then, but most of the time we're just fumbling on our own.
Right. Yeah, to me, one of the things that characterized Calvin especially, and I think Luther as well, was this craving for certainty, and which
funny enough, it ultimately, like, I feel like the craving for certainty leads to this ultimate uncertainty.
Yeah.
Where you find in some of Calvin's writings even saying like, oh yeah, you never know, like, oh, here's all these people that look like they're one of us, but
right,
they're not.
exactly.
And it's like you can never be too sure. And like,
God is inscrutable, his will.
And I do think that's there's something absolutely fundamentally correct in that sense, of which we should never underestimate our own ability to deceive ourselves, because I think, that's something I think is inscrutably deep. And I think,
yeah, that's true.
I think that's a lot of what Peterson shows in his work, that is like, that is a very deep thing that we're all struggling with today.
Lying to ourselves and to others.
Yeah.
Or as Vervaeke would say, bullshitting ourselves.
Yeah. And again, it's so pervasive that we filter all our ingestion of other ideas through it. Like we often, even when other people aren't, well, it's weird because, okay, so like, he makes a distinction between lying and purposeful deception,
Mhm.
because I think, and he says, well, I think he says really focus on when you're purposefully introducing deception, because most of the time we're oftentimes telling little lies or falsehoods just because we've done it before,
Mhm.
or we've heard it from somewhere else, and we've ingested it into us, and we that we can't even know. Like, that's just kind of table stakes for the world we're in. We can't really do anything about it, but we need to be ultra careful about when we take that extra step of twisting it.
Right.
And we've talked about this previously too, and you mentioned, like, well, to what degree is holding back and not saying something you feel when you have the opportunity to lie. And I do think, yeah, that's something I really struggle with too. Like,
Mhm.
because I feel like in some sense, like, you almost, you have to, like, it's the hardest part, I think, about being a person, is exposing those deep thoughts you have about things so that they can come out to the light, so that you can come to find out whether they are rooted in truth or not. Whereas, like, when they stay kind of hidden, you just, you lose an ability to get some sort of empirical phenomenological evidence one way or another. To,
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenge. Uh, and it's often, more often than not, it's fear that keeps us from doing that. And um,
yeah, I find that that's always at the root of things that I do that I'm later ashamed of that I did. Almost always it's some sort of thing I was afraid of, that was, that in a severe avoidance and a willingness to kind of deceive myself that I was, doing something for the right reasons, when really I was all just to avoid some sort of disclosure of myself
yeah,
to the world.
either that or avoiding the discomfort of telling the truth, because a lot of times that's the case for me. I don't want to, deal with conflict and the emotions that always rise up within me.
Yeah.
I seem to have no control over. So anyway, yeah, there are lots of excuses. So I think that's probably where wisdom comes in, though, just knowing the right appropriate time and place, etc. I think you can always question your motivations till the last day, when
Yeah.
great judgment, you can question your motivations. But yeah, at some point, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess one of the things I was saying, and I don't know if we need to go back there necessarily, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me though that you have, at least on a couple of occasions during this discussion, gone back to the Reformation, because like, what's that got to do with anything? But I think like you say, it has a lot to do with us in the West, especially, far more than we realize.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think I don't. I mean, people have commented on this, but I don't. But we wouldn't even have this idea of the modern nation state without it. I really don't think.
yeah,
And I don't think anybody, like, takes that, how seriously that affects us.
right.
And this concept of this separation between church and state, this sense of, like, religion being a private affair, all this stuff, um, yeah, it's really deeply wound up in our thinking.
Yeah,
Um,
I think one of the things that one of the things that that I think about in all of this is, we're talking about our kind of our craving for certainty, and how in the strangest, sort of most paradoxical way, it winds up consuming and eating away all of our certainty, or any degree of certainty, kind of in the postmodern result of it all. It's kind of like modernism turning into postmodernism, because the it can't sustain, its burden to bring us to certainty. Modernism can't. So, but I was thinking, one of the things I was relating it to in my mind, and to me, it's an interesting discussion all in itself to talk about nature, human nature, and it's just what that is. And to me, that again, from a Christian perspective, that's inevitably going to lead to, in a sense, a split personality, to a binary of sorts. That's
what Luke always calls the divided man.
yeah, yeah. What I'm thinking of is our created nature, by God's design, you could say, and our fallen nature. Because I think we often in Christian circles think about ourselves and others in terms of fallenness, our and it's often referred to as the fallen nature or the flesh. But that that in our fallenness, whatever that means, ontologically or otherwise, that one of the moves of our fallen disposition is to move toward the certainty of the letter, and contrasting the letter to the spirit. And to me, that's kind of typical of the whole Reformation move. It's like we want to focus on the letter, sola scriptura, the authority of Scripture, etc. And that the great irony of that move is that that I think, again, if I understand Paul the apostle, he kind of sets forth a pattern where he says, this thing, even the thing that was written by the finger of God in stone, is something that's passing away. Its glory is fading. And there's a new way, and it's the way of the Spirit, So
so before we started on here, I was reading some of that real quick quote, which has some very it was the one Sherry had shared in the Boxer, and
yeah.
There was some very interesting ontological statements there about the sense in which even God himself is in this sort of process of, I think it used the word gestation, right? So there's a sense in which this idea of this sort of inbuilt thing of a sort of nostalgia and going to a past and recovering it is definitely contrary to what God's doing, which is always about a sort of, I think in a real quick quote, is a new beginning. And Jesus, behold, I make all things new.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about that's radically disconcerting to folks who don't want to have the headache of having to trust that new beginning is a good thing.
Yeah.
That it won't fundamentally disorder and destroy whatever, power structures they have in place that give them a level of predictability and feeling of safety, in their lives.
Right.
And so I think, but it's funny too. It's like, we talked about this earlier, and I don't want to rehash it too much, but this rejection of you have this fundamental, pushing of the letter for certainty, but then you have this rejection of it also that tries to move towards its own sort of sacred, certainty
Right.
in these ultimate claims of right and wrong, even while claiming a sort of like radical tolerance of everything and anyone.
Yeah.
And it still leads to this state, well, okay, the only thing you can be guilty of is intolerance. And then that's the worst thing, and so it creates this new orthodoxy around intolerance,
Right.
and finding and destroying those who showcase that.
Yeah.
It's it's very strange.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know how much time do you have left that you can chat?
I mean, I don't have anything I have to do like you
Okay.
probably do. So,
Well, I wanted before we close out to go into some of his introduction of the transcendentals. And
yeah.
I was thinking about, I kind of wish we started here. I feel like I have a tendency to always start with the small, and the small things are so trivial in a certain sense that I go down all these bunny trails when like really I like there's some meat that I really want to go after, but like I have this tendency to kind of wait or like feel like I need to build up to that.
Right. Sure.
Or like maybe it's too big for me to tackle, so like I'll save it for later and then I never do. This is like my life in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And I think some of it's also a sense in which wrestling with those big things, I don't feel up to the task, and that I'm gonna put on display how my inadequacies when I do.
Yeah.
But this idea, so he talks about, I think this is fundamental, like this is the fundamental like setting on the stage, right? So he has this reversal of the transcendentals where he puts beauty first, then goodness, then truth. And so he talks about beauty first as this thing because beauty is the thing that awakens our desire, and our first intellectual capacities. So he says, quote unquote, the quote, the delight we have in our senses, which manifest our desire to know, is in fact a description of the experience of beauty. I'm curious, is there anything in that immediately like pops to your mind in response, or things that pop out to you about that? The delight we have in our senses, which manifests our desire to know, is in fact a description of the experience of beauty.
The delight. Yeah. The delight we have in our senses. Yeah, I'm not sure I can add anything to it, because to me it's almost like a description of the most fundamental experience of beauty itself that you can't,
Yeah.
in some ways.
Well, remember, elsewhere he talks about beauty as also fundamentally aligned to like it is a metaphor for perception itself as well.
Yeah.
So what I guess what I take out of this, I wrote this down, that like this calls to me that beauty is fundamentally, because it's funny because he talks about beauty being kind of sort of like it's a superficial thing, right? It's in the appearances, and yet simultaneously it is awakening a desire for something much deeper. And it's sort of it awakens a sense of the possibility and a sort of faith that inner reality exists, and therefore we're kind of like drawn out of ourselves to go explore and go find that thing.
So the appearance is not, I mean, it sounds superficial, but it's, in this respect, it's not really superficial. It's revealing, it's shining in that phenomenological sense, such that it's saying more than just a superficial conception of that.
It contains a real invitation to the deepest realities of creation.
Yeah.
And so again, that fundamental divide between, okay, I can trust that this is a trustworthy invitation, or this is a wild goose chase that ends in disappointment, despair, and death.
Right. Yeah. And if you're trusting it, I mean, I guess it's the transition from, in a sense, the revelation, the I'm trying to think of a word that, and of course, I can't think of the guy who said the word that I can't think of. kind of, I know he's like a theologian, phenomenologist, whatever that word is. And uh, saturation, I think, is the word he uses a lot.
Is it somebody in the Heideggerian tradition, like Husserl, or
No, he's a Catholic theologian he's French.
is it the guy that John Bear makes a quote of? He's
He
like something Michel.
I'm not sure.
One of his books, I think it's John, the book about John the theologian, makes reference to this French phenomenologist. I can't remember his name.
Yeah. This guy, I mean, he's alive, and I just saw him on a video
Oh, really?
asking who was it? It was one of those Lumen Christi conferences they have at Notre Dame.
So maybe it's this guy that, Matt Allison had. There was a guy he was really taken with that wrote some books like I think in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
On it was another French phenomenologist and a Catholic.
Yeah.
I can't remember the guy's name.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm almost certain he uses seems like he uses the word saturation as kind of in a unique phenomenological. I got it out.
Yeah.
It's almost as bad as trying to say apokatastasis or whatever it is. It's like, whoa, this is too much for me.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, but it's like again, I think the challenge is that we're so used to looking at things superficially that I don't know, it just seems like an enormous challenge to get people to stop and pay attention and appreciate the beauty, and in that respect have an opportunity to experience something that leads them into the depths.
Right. And he makes this point that traditionally beauty always was referenced, even though there was many different, kind of takes on it throughout the time. It always had a sense of a sort of unity of opposites. Like in some people, sometimes some people might focus on the infinite and the finite, and that beauty was the union of those two things. Or I can't remember who he was talking about. I think it was Schiller. He talks a lot about the different, kind of dichotomies that he brings into bear for this idea of beauty. But it always had this sense of so in a sense, it is a manifestation of kind of the superficial, the appearance, but it's also it's a manifestation of the depths as well. And that those two things become unified somehow in the moment of beauty and the experience of beauty.
Right.
And so what I got out of that was I wrote down that this corresponds with attention or consciousness. And that, and because again, this is the thing, and Peterson makes this point that we can't talk ourselves out of the fundamental, that phenomenological experience of beauty. We just can't talk ourselves out of. He talks about the nihilists who still find themselves enthralled to their punk rock music and have a sense of meaning even in their nihilism, some sort of existential sense of the depths of reality that they are drawn into, even in their attempts to deny it. So and I've met so many people that, are, died in the wool materialists, but then, they have this sense of just the depths of reality, going to music and concerts and stuff like that they is almost like they're kind of religion of sorts.
Right.
And it's something even if you don't think there's something more, you can't deny that you experience that there is something more.
Right.
In those moments. And I think attention is so important, and why it needs to be first in this sort of pyramid, because again, we're so conditioned by this sort of pack of lies and the ways in which propaganda can be amplified and spread in just crazy ways now. And so that we need to have attention as some sort of primary attention and beauty as a primary kind of like starting place, because otherwise we can't see the ways in which our current pattern in paradigms for understanding the world are just fundamentally false. Even if they're good, even if they're useful, they're still so distorted as to that they always need to be updated, and they always, there's always a sense in which we need to, we need that sort of, we need that doubt, but we need a sort of doubt of the right things and a sort of trust in the right things. And that by putting the attention first, kind of puts us back at some sort of basic level of participation with reality, such that we can come to see and know things that are completely contrary to all these, like, these desiccated forms of what we call knowledge that we think is what it means to be smart, well-informed, in the know, an intellectual, to be wise even, and yet like just can't stand up to any real scrutiny of any meaningful attention sustained over a longer period of time. Will kind of like make them melt away with something bigger and deeper that just supplants them instantly when we pay attention and to those moments, and especially when we see the beautiful and we allow it to draw us, out of ourselves.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of sitting here. What keeps coming to my mind is, but how are you going to persuade anybody, uh, you know, about this, or influence? Persuade sounds, like it's just very, propositionally oriented.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that, again, it might be somewhere later in the book that he unfolds an answer to some of these questions, but I'm sure it must, obviously it has to include the arts, etc., and all those things where beautiful things are created that, when they come out of a place of acknowledging and recognizing the reality that beauty has.
Yeah.
And it's kind of reflected in that work of art, whether it's literature or, painting or sculpture or what have you, ballet or whatever, that in some way it will have its own persuasive quality about it.
Yeah.
There still seems that culturally, it's like the ship is so big and it's melting through the corrosive effects of postmodernism. Are you going to even have a ship to turn around, let alone how can I turn around the ship? So it can't be something that's obviously compelled from the outside. It has to, in a sense, happen internally. It's almost, I want to think about Pentecostal revivals almost, a move of the spirit in some respect. But yeah.
In terms of what's persuasive, I think what's ultimately persuasive for me, and what is coming to face with things that just sort of intractable facts that are just throwing a wrench in kind of my oversimplified, understandings of things.
Yeah.
So again, it's not so much that I come to any sort of like real, like, complete, like, new understanding or something kind of positive in another direction. It's sort of a negative of just being able to cast aside these sort of veils of perception, and at least temporarily have a sense of hope and possibility that there's more.
Yeah.
It's the dawning that I'm not as smart as I think I am, that I haven't, which I could propositionally articulate to you why I know that I'm not as smart as I think I am. And I could give you examples even of all the ways I make mistakes. But then there's another sense in which, just from a pragmatic point of view, you always have to kind of pretend, that like you have it together to move forward to some degree, and you kind of sometimes you forget where you're doing that.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think it's a bad thing that you do that, because I think you have to kind of like you have to have. Well, let's keep going through these other transcendentals. So
Okay.
I linked beauty with attention, and then when he talks about goodness, he says in goodness, man pursues the real, engaging in the free action that is inescapably a kind of gift of self. Now I think this is exactly what we were talking about earlier, where like that need to be willing to give of the self, like all your your freest actions are a sort of revelation of the deepest particulars of you as an individual and personal. Like that's paradoxically is the deepest revelations of who God is, as well. So this is so in the free action that is inescapably a kind of gift of self, an involvement of his person with what is other than himself. Um, I think beauty is about the attention. It's about what we focus, and it has the seeds of possibility that again pull us out of ourselves and enable us to take action, to have a sense of hope and possibility. In there's something I can move from point A to point B, and B is better in some like real way, not not necessarily in a way that I can articulate or understand, but that I'm drawn by that sense of beauty into a sense of possibility that I can move from A to B, and that there's always within that movement a sort of gift of self, which is interesting, because like no matter what you do, right, at the end of the day, you're on this earth for some period of time. Everything you do is a gift of yourself. Everything. Now it's even like even when you're being selfish in a certain sense, like there's still a giving away of oneself, even in that, like that you can't not do this. So I think for myself, the only like sort of resistance I give to this is just trying to do nothing. Like I have this sort of informational paralysis and a desire for certainty, and like I'm not going to do anything until I know the thing to do. I'm going to sit here and that's I think the sort of worst thing you can do, in a lot of scenarios, is just kind of like we'll do nothing until I have an absolute certainty that I can have a plan that takes me from A to Z, and Z is the ultimate or penultimate goal of my life, and then okay, now I'll start on the journey.
Right.
Um, and there's something about beauty. I think again, it manifests this goodness such that we can take the action. Like we have the kind of fuel to kind of get out of ourselves and do something. And then he says, in truth, so moving from beauty to goodness to truth, he says, in truth, he, talking about the person on this journey, becomes what he knows. He identifies himself in a certain respect with what he comes to understand, taking it into his very being. And what I put down there, so I have attention for beauty, I have action for goodness, and then for truth, I have speech or language. Like, so what's interesting here is, again, it's in the vein of what we want, which is a sort of, we want to be determining our identity in some sense. But here, and so that we are determining here to be identified with what we come to understand. And so speech is so very interesting to me, because in a certain sense, it is the fulfillment of this process. This is in his sort of lane or in out of it here, it is where we become to be. We become, our identity changes. We become transformed with what we come to know and understand. And it's in a form that we have there's some, you can see this sort of choice being made there that we identify with by what we say, but what we choose. And yet it is a sense of understanding, grasping something outside of ourselves. So it's alignment with who we are in a deep way to the external world. That is the experience of truth.
Yeah.
And this is where, again, like we transmit this to each other in propositional ways through truth, through speech and language. And on the one hand, again, it's the culmination of this process. But on the other hand, it has so significant actions on. I've always liked, I've said this before, like language is magic in terms of like I can refocus the attention of other people around me to see things in a clearer or more distorted manner, right? And I can use speech in ways that warp people's sense of goodness, or even doubt that goodness even is a thing that's there. So it's like it is sort of the height of these things, but it also has these like levers back into goodness and beauty. And I think in our mode today, where we place truth first, it does have this sort of, it does put us in this mode where like, it's just whatever arbitrarily I say is reality, and there is a truth to that in a certain sense. Like there is this power in the tongue and in speech. Like, again, there is magical quality to create, and to sustain, even in the absence of you watch like with something like a con artist, how they're able to sustain these realities that have these enormous consequences in the world that are just complete fabrications. And really, I was watching one recently. My wife picked out on Netflix, I think it was like this guy that like had like done this with many women at the same time and like got them to like spend, I don't know, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on them, with the hope or promise of maybe like, some sort of romantic relationship. And it's the sort of power, there is just phenomenal. Like, it's just like, oh, it's like you see how it can so closely illuminate and give light, and also just be so warped and evil, when it gets to this culmination.
Right. Yep. Yeah. You said it was evil, and that to me, that kind of takes me back in a way to where we started, because evil, there's no logic for evil. There's no rationality to it. You really can't figure it out. And when it comes to, you kind of ask the question about why basically, I guess in a way, why do we embrace postmodernism? Why do we live in a denial of reality, just fundamentally?
Yeah.
And it kind of takes you back to evil. And again, there's really no explanation or rationality in a way to it when you get it to the bottom, to me. So yeah.
Well, and I fundamentally think, evil as its fundamental root is a sort of, it's all rooted in a sort of fear that, again, the inner reality is not good. This, like, again, this sort of journey of awakened by beauty into action, and then a conforming of that in your own identity via truth and your understanding, is to be some sort of slave to like something diabolical. It sees at kind of the very root of everything, this sort of like will to power, like this sort of, if there is a God, he's a maniacal monster and he's created us for his own entertainment. So the best thing I can do is kind of opt out of that game altogether, and be a sort of be as deceptive as I think reality itself is in its very nature.
Right. Children of the devil, as Jesus put it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the deepest sense, offspring, because our behavior, etc., our reasoning, as unreasonable as it might truly be, is kind of what, at least mythologically, we tend to ascribe to Lucifer or Satan,
Yeah.
So it is fundamentally, even there, it seems a lack of trust in the infinite love of God in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when people are able to be able, like like a figure like such as Lucifer, the devil, like that's able to sustain themselves in this sort of running away from the truth, and able to continue to, and even in that the previous documentary about this guy that's swindling women, they're fundamental, like when confronted, to still never be able to drop the mask.
Yeah.
And how, man, just like how oppressive that must be.
Yeah.
To know in some sense. I don't know. There's a great movie. I really love this movie. It's called it was one of Christopher Nolan's first films, Memento. Did you ever see that?
I did. I think I did. Pretty sure.
With I think it's Guy Pearce.
Is that the one where?
Yeah. He's a guy. He can't. Yeah. And the story's quite told backwards.
Yeah.
And very inventive. And I mean, I've watched that film like probably, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 times.
Wow.
And each time I watch it though, like you still like the way there's enough complication in how the story unravels that you experience it like every time freshly from the perspective of this person that has this memory problem.
Yeah.
And he like gets tattoos and has to have like Post-it notes everywhere to keep him going. And the storytelling is so done. But anyway, that's this guy very conveniently, since he has the lack of short-term memory, just as spoiler alert, if anybody's going to watch it, he uses that ultimately to deceive himself because he can't face the reality of the situation. So he doesn't have it within himself to like to take a hard look in the mirror at like, and have any real change. And of course he's aided by this plot device, of which is that he forgets things anyway. Yeah. But then when he has the critical moment when he could write down some real truth and transmit it to his future self, he declines.
Huh. Yeah. That is interesting. Yeah. Seems like a fitting parable or whatever, the way we live our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything in these chapters so far that you feel like you would like to dig into some more? I feel like I always go in all these random paths. I have a very hard time moving in a straight line.
It's interesting. I love to see how imaginative we can get, the way our minds and imaginations work, that leads us to discover other things that we wouldn't, if we just stuck on the script, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, but no, I don't have, I think we'll need to come back to chapter 2 and finish it out. The third section is really the larger and sort of the conclusion of the chapter, or some resolution to the
Yeah.
problems that he raises earlier in the chapter. But I definitely want to dig further into just like I think Barfield kind of assumes a lot, even about the basics of Platonic philosophy. I think that Schindler assumes some things about phenomenology.
Yeah.
It's only like if you're familiar with that language and just the basics of that approach, kind of especially to epistemology, that you won't get as much as you could have otherwise. And
Yeah. He seems like he's tying, he's definitely tying the ancient to these sort of, modern, phenomenological approaches,
right.
which
Yeah.
I think is sort of thing. It's the only thing we can do, because we've lost such a faith in any sort of like articulated propositional forms of knowing. And so we need a sort of guidance to get back to some sort of root of understanding
Right.
that has a part of its framework of understanding is like what's happening when we, look and experience the world just at a sensory level of experience, and bringing that together. What's going on? What sort of experiences can we all reliably produce and have a shared kind of framework for talking about with one another?
Yeah. Another thing I would like to explore further is, maybe in our next video, is this coincidence of the opposites, and kind of what that means, and maybe some examples. Because I just recently, I'm starting to get into Nicholas of Cusa, because Milbank, for one reason, nearly everything I hear or read, he's bringing Cusa up. It's like, I need to know who this guy is, and why is he so important? And anyway, that's one of the things that Cusa is kind of big on, is the coincidence of the opposites when it comes to the being of God, even, I think. But anyway, I would like to explore further what it means in terms of what does this have, because the one thing that Schindler does say is like there's so many, maybe a lot of disagreements and variations on how people in general might define beauty. But the one thing that they tend to agree on is this coincidence of the opposites. So
Yeah.
And just as an artist, I have ideas, when I'm doing a painting, that, if there's any degree, I mean, if it's static and predictable, and the composition is very regimented, it's just not pretty. It's only when the composition is sort of imbalanced yet balanced. Like you have a large object over here on the left side of the canvas, then you've got to have small distinctive objects further away on the right side of the canvas, so to speak. In other words, they're tricks of composition that you kind of learn, but you don't know why they work necessarily.
Right.
But they do, and the things that tend to implement these things tend to be regarded as more beautiful. So anyway, to me, that kind of is a lived experience of what the coincidence of opposites means, at least in terms of art.
Yeah.
And that speaks to something greater itself, the reality. Anyway, so